For almost 20 years, the humans and the Empire had lived under a fragile peace. It was not real friendship, more like a cold agreement to stop fighting. Both sides were tired of war, tired of burying their young and rebuilding cities again and again. But even when the guns went quiet, mistrust remained. Every handshake carried doubt. Every treaty felt like a pause, not an end. The Human Federation had sent one of its most trusted diplomats to the imperial capital. His name was Ambassador Hale, a calm and thoughtful man who had spent most of his life working to avoid bloodshed. People respected him because he believed that words could be stronger than weapons. He had been the face of peace talks for many years and had earned the title of the man who could calm storms. Hale arrived on the shining world of Valus, the heart of the Empire. Its skies were bright silver and its cities stretched like rivers of glass and steel. The imperial leaders welcomed him politely, smiling for the cameras, but behind the smiles was something colder. Distance, maybe even quiet anger. Hale noticed it but chose not to speak. His mission was simple: sign the final peace agreement that would officially end all hostilities and open trade between both civilizations. Back home, people watched the news with cautious hope. Human colonies had suffered too much during the last conflict. Families still lived with the memory of bombings and hunger. The idea that peace was finally possible made everyone breathe a little easier. On the day of the main conference, Hale spoke with quiet confidence. Peace, he said, is not built by words alone, but by the courage to trust. His speech was short but powerful. Even imperial delegates nodded in respect. Cameras flashed and the broadcast spread across planets. It felt like history was being written, the start of a new chapter. That night, a grand dinner was held in the imperial palace. Music echoed softly in the halls, and both human and imperial flags stood side by side for the first time. People laughed carefully, talked in rehearsed tones, and tried to sound optimistic. Hale stayed calm but observant. He had spent years studying body language, and he could tell that something felt slightly off. The imperial guards were more alert than usual, their eyes scanning every corner. Later, when the dinner ended, Hale returned to his guest quarters, a beautifully designed room with golden lights and large windows showing the city below. He wrote a few lines in his travel journal, something he always did before sleeping. His notes were calm, thoughtful, and full of quiet hope. Tomorrow, he wrote, the signatures will mark a new age. I pray that both sides are ready to forgive. But by morning, that hope had vanished. When the attendants came to wake him, they found his room sealed and silent. Inside, the diplomat lay motionless. The medical team declared him dead. The official reason given was heart failure, but almost no one believed it. Hale had passed his medical checks just days before, perfectly healthy. The news hit the Human Federation like a lightning bolt. At first, confusion, then disbelief, and then anger. People demanded answers. How could one of their most respected ambassadors die suddenly, in the middle of peace talks under imperial protection? The Empire released a short statement offering condolences and promising an investigation, but their message sounded cold, too clean, too political. Within hours, the story filled every screen, every broadcast, every street conversation. On Earth and across the colonies, crowds gathered with candles and posters that read, "Justice for Hale." Even those who had once doubted the peace treaty now stood in unity, hearts burning with grief. The Federation leaders tried to stay calm. They called for patience and truth. Behind closed doors, though, fear and fury spread through every meeting. Some officers believed the Empire had planned it, that they had never intended peace at all. Others said it could be an accident or even a third-party plot. But nobody could prove anything. Meanwhile, a small piece of footage leaked from the imperial capital, grainy, shaky, and quickly deleted from public channels. It appeared to show two unknown figures entering the diplomat's room the night before his death. The Empire called it a fake, but the Federation's intelligence analysts believed otherwise. That was enough to turn suspicion into rage. Across human colonies, protests turned louder. People shouted for their leaders to stop being weak. They wanted answers, and if the Empire wouldn't give them, they wanted action. "If they can kill our peacemaker," one man said on a broadcast, "what will they do next?" The Federation president appeared on live transmission, his face pale but firm. "We will not jump to conclusions," he said, "but we will not allow any act of aggression to go unanswered." His words were meant to calm people, yet they had the opposite effect. The message sounded like a quiet threat, and the public loved it. In the following days, small border patrols reported increased imperial activity near human territories. Trade routes were temporarily frozen. Military transports began to move again for precaution. Both sides blamed each other for breaking the peace. In the midst of all this chaos, one woman, an assistant who had worked closely with Hale, found herself unable to sleep. She remembered the last words he had spoken before leaving for the Empire. "If something happens to me, promise you'll keep believing in peace." His voice echoed in her mind every night. She wanted to believe, but with every new headline, peace felt further away. Weeks passed, and the investigation into Hale's death seemed to vanish into silence. The Empire stopped responding to inquiries, saying the matter was internal. The Federation demanded access to Imperial records, but their request was denied. Every day without an answer made people more restless. On one colony world, a crowd surrounded the local Imperial embassy, throwing stones and chanting slogans. Soldiers were ordered to protect the building but not fire. Still, clashes broke out. Nobody was killed, but several were injured. The images spread instantly across the networks. Commentators started using phrases like the end of diplomacy. The tension was no longer just political, it was emotional. People began boycotting Imperial goods. Others refused to work on joint trade projects. Children at schools argued about who was right and who was wrong. It wasn't just a story anymore. It was personal. Back in the Federation capital, the council gathered for emergency meetings almost daily. The military representatives spoke with growing impatience. "We cannot sit and wait," one general said. "Every moment we look weak, they grow stronger." The diplomats, fewer and fewer each day, kept arguing for restraint. "If we make the wrong move," one replied, "we may never recover from the consequences." The president sat quietly through most of it, listening, thinking, aging faster than ever. He knew that public opinion was turning and that any sign of hesitation could destroy his leadership. Yet deep inside, he also knew that once the first shot was fired, there would be no turning back. On the final evening of the week, the Federation news channels released a breaking update. Imperial government refuses to extradite suspects. That single headline changed everything. People poured into the streets. Flags were raised, voices shouted, fists lifted. On the steps of the Federation Hall, thousands gathered, calling for strength, for justice, for war if necessary. They did not see faces of soldiers or politicians. They saw the face of the diplomat who had died alone in a foreign room, the man who had once believed that words could save lives. At midnight, the president appeared again on every screen. His speech was brief but heavy. "We wanted peace," he said slowly. "We believed in trust. But if peace cannot protect our people, then we must protect them ourselves." Silence filled the room after his words. And then, as if the whole galaxy had been holding its breath, the crowd roared. Across the night sky of 100 human worlds, beacons lit up. Fleet orders were quietly transmitted. Defense forces began to move. No one said the word war, not yet, but everyone could feel it coming. Somewhere, far from the shouting cities, the late diplomat's assistant sat by a quiet window, holding the old travel journal that had been recovered from his belongings. She opened it to the last line he ever wrote. "Tomorrow, peace will begin." She closed the book slowly and whispered, "I wish you were right." Outside, the stars looked the same, peaceful, distant, indifferent, but deep below them, humanity had already begun to change. The line between defense and revenge was fading fast. The fragile peace that had held two great powers together for a generation was gone, broken by one silent night on a foreign world. And as the first ships prepared to move toward the borders, people didn't yet realize that this single loss, the death of one man who had believed in peace, would ignite the greatest conflict their species had ever known. The days after the ambassador's death felt like the calm before a storm, quiet on the surface but full of noise underneath. On every planet of the Human Federation, people were angry, sad, and confused. The peace that had once seemed so close now felt like a broken promise. At first, the government asked everyone to stay calm. The official investigation, they said, was still going on. But deep inside, most people had already made up their minds. They believed the Empire had done it, and that someone had to pay. News channels kept playing the same short clip of the diplomat's final speech, his calm face speaking about trust and forgiveness. That image became a symbol. People printed it on posters, shared it online, and held candlelight gatherings in his memory. But grief slowly began to turn into anger. One morning, a leak appeared on the network. A short piece of video that supposedly came from a security camera inside the Imperial Palace. The clip was dark and blurry, but it seemed to show two shadowy figures entering the diplomat's room on the night before his death. The file was removed almost instantly, and Imperial officials called it a fake created by enemies. But it was too late. The damage was done. People wanted answers, not explanations. They no longer cared about diplomatic language or polite statements. The Empire's denial only made things worse. The more the Empire said it was innocent, the more people thought it was hiding the truth. In the Federation's main capital, crowds began to fill the streets. They carried banners and shouted for justice. It started peacefully with flowers and silence, but soon voices grew louder. The streets that once celebrated peace were now filled with cries of betrayal. In newsrooms, journalists debated every theory. Some said the Empire had planned the assassination to stop the peace deal. Others believed it was an inside job, that someone within the Federation wanted the war to start again. But the louder the debates got, the more people stopped caring about logic. They wanted to see action. They wanted to see strength. Behind closed doors, the Federation's council met again and again. The president looked exhausted. His ministers argued nonstop. The generals, sitting in their crisp uniforms, pushed for firm retaliation. The diplomats, their voices tired and quiet, begged for patience. "We can't attack without proof," one advisor said. "We already have proof," a general snapped back. "It's on every screen in the system." "But that footage isn't verified," another protested. The general leaned forward. "People don't care about verification. They care that their ambassador is dead. And if we do nothing, we look weak." The room fell silent. Everyone knew he was right. Not about the truth, but about what people expected. The president finally stood up, walked to the window, and looked at the bright city lights below. "If we strike first," he said softly, "we might start something we can't stop." No one replied. They all knew that the war was already starting, not on the battlefield, but in people's hearts. On the Imperial side, things were just as tense. The Empire's leadership insisted it had nothing to do with the murder. But whispers spread that some of its own citizens doubted that. Trade officials complained that the Federation was freezing agreements. Imperial merchants were turned away from human spaceports. Even Imperial travelers began to fear for their safety in Federation territories. Both governments started building their defenses, just in case. Warships quietly left their docks for training exercises. Communication channels between the two sides grew colder by the day. The peace treaty, which had once been the talk of the galaxy, was now just a fading memory. Back among the people, emotions kept building. In schools, teachers struggled to explain to students why peace had failed again. "Did they kill him?" one child asked. "Why do adults always fight?" The teacher had no answer. In cafes and markets, ordinary citizens argued with strangers about who was right and who was wrong. Some still believed in diplomacy. Others said peace had always been a lie. A week after the ambassador's death, the Federation's news service announced that the Imperial government had refused to send any representatives to the investigation committee. That single announcement changed everything. The protests doubled overnight. On some worlds, crowds gathered around government buildings shouting for war. They held up signs that read, "No more silence" and "Protect our honor." People who had never cared about politics were now shouting at the top of their lungs. The president, realizing how far things had gone, gave a televised speech. His tone was heavy and deliberate. "We have reached out for peace," he said. "But if our hand is bitten, we cannot simply pull back and pretend nothing happened." His words echoed across thousands of worlds. They were calm, but the meaning was clear. The Federation was preparing for something bigger. At the same time, families all over the Federation were feeling the change in their daily lives. Young men and women began receiving calls from the Defense Bureau. Some were asked to report for special training, just in case. Travel between Imperial and human territories became restricted. Fear grew quietly, like a shadow that touched every home. In one small city, a young woman named Lyra, who had once worked as the ambassador's aide, sat alone watching the news. She had helped him write his speeches, had seen how he believed in peace more than anyone she'd ever known. Now, as she listened to politicians shouting and crowds calling for war, she couldn't help but whisper, "This isn't what he wanted." Her words were lost in the noise of the world. The next morning, a massive military parade took place in the Federation's capital. It was called a memorial march for the ambassador, but everyone knew what it really meant. Rows of soldiers stood in perfect lines, ships flew above in formation, and the crowd cheered with pride. People were not mourning anymore. They were preparing themselves mentally for battle. Reporters described it as the rebirth of unity. Yet in the quiet corners of the same city, there were still those who feared what was coming. Some whispered that if the truth about the ambassador's death ever came out, it might reveal something no one wanted to believe. In a private meeting that same evening, intelligence officers presented new data to the Federation president. The evidence, they said, linked the murder to an imperial agent. The report was thin, just a few encrypted messages and unverified witness statements, but it was enough for the generals. "This is it," one of them said. "This is our justification." The president stared at the file for a long time. He didn't say anything, but inside he felt trapped. The people demanded revenge. The military demanded action. And if he refused both, his government would fall apart. He finally gave a short nod. "Prepare our defenses," he said. "But don't make the first move." Not yet. That not yet would not last long. 2 days later, something unexpected happened. A Federation transport ship exploded near the border. The Empire said it was an accident caused by a fuel leak. The Federation claimed it was an attack. Nobody knew the truth, but it didn't matter. Within hours, angry messages filled the networks again. For the public, this was the final straw. "First our ambassador, now our crew," people shouted. How much longer will we stay silent? That night, the president gathered his closest advisors. The air in the room was heavy. Everyone already knew what was about to be said. "We can't wait any longer," the defense minister began. "If we delay, we'll look weak. We must respond now, firmly but controlled." The president took a deep breath and closed his eyes for a moment. He saw the ambassador's face in his mind, calm, wise, hopeful. Then he looked up and said, "Do what must be done. But remember, this isn't war. It's protection." Orders were sent in secret. Fleets began to move toward the border, officially for security patrols. The Empire noticed immediately and sent its own forces to mirror the move. Space that had once been open for trade was now filled with military presence. Still, both sides avoided calling it war. They used softer words: response and measure, deterrence. But deep down, everyone knew what was really happening. In the middle of all this, ordinary people continued living their lives, going to work, cooking dinner, watching the news, but fear sat quietly in every home. Parents comforted children. Soldiers kissed their families goodbye without saying where they were going. Everyone pretended life was normal, though it no longer was. Lyra sat again by her window that night, the ambassador's old notebook in her hands. The last line still read, "Tomorrow peace will begin." She traced the letters with her fingers, wondering how everything had gone so wrong so fast. Outside, the stars shone just as they always did, bright and peaceful, as if they knew nothing about the anger growing below. And somewhere, far across the cold distance between two civilizations, the first fleets faced each other in silence, waiting for the moment when words would finally fail and history would change forever. The spark had been lit, and no one could put it out. The sky over the Federation's main capital looked peaceful that morning, but everyone knew peace was gone. For weeks, people had been waiting, watching, guessing what would happen next. The border fleets were already in position. Soldiers were ready. Every citizen could feel that something big was about to begin, something that no one could stop. The president sat in his office, staring at the silent communication screen in front of him. Reports kept coming in, imperial ships moving near human colonies, transmissions filled with threats and warnings. Each message made his heart heavier. He had hoped that both sides would back down before it went too far. But it was clear that hope was fading fast. Meanwhile, Admiral Ortega, one of the Federation's most respected military leaders, stood inside her flagship, staring at the wide view of space. She was known for her discipline and calm nature. She didn't speak much, but when she did, everyone listened. For days she had been waiting for final orders, knowing that one message from the capital could change everything. On the other side of the border, the Empire was also preparing. Its commanders believed that the humans were planning an attack. Rumors spread through their ranks that the Federation had already begun building new weapons. Fear and pride mixed together. Both sides now convinced that they were defending themselves. The tension grew every hour. Even small mistakes could be seen as acts of war. Then one night, an Imperial patrol ship crossed a restricted zone near a human station. It was a simple navigation error. The pilot later claimed he had followed the wrong beacon, but the Federation's sensors picked it up as a possible threat. Defense systems locked on automatically, and alarms filled the control room. Messages were sent quickly between commanders, asking what to do. "Should we engage?" one officer asked. There was confusion and panic. Nobody wanted to be the first to act, but nobody wanted to look weak either. The ship ignored 3 warnings to turn back. Finally, a small defense drone fired a warning flare. The bright light flashed across space, harmless but unmistakable. That single flash was all it took. Within hours, news channels reported it as an attack. Headlines screamed, "Empire violates border, human station threatened." The Federation's people reacted with outrage. In their eyes, it was no longer just about the ambassador. It was about defending their entire race. The president gathered his council again that night. The air was thick with tension. The generals demanded permission to strike back. "They've crossed our line," one said. "If we let this go, they'll keep testing us." The diplomats argued for restraint. "It was a mistake," one insisted. "We can still talk. We can still stop this." But their voices were drowned out by anger and fear. Every message from the colonies was filled with panic. People were demanding protection. The president closed his eyes for a long moment, then opened them slowly. "Authorize limited operations," he said quietly. "Target only their forward bases. No civilian areas. No full war, just enough to show we will not be pushed." Those were the words that changed everything. At dawn, the Federation fleets began to move. The hum of engines echoed through the decks as soldiers prepared in silence. Admiral Ortega stood at the front window of her command ship, watching stars drift past. Her crew waited for her command. She looked calm, but her thoughts were heavy. She had trained her entire life to protect people, not to start wars. When the signal came through, it was short and direct. "Proceed with Operation Dawnlight." She nodded to her officers and the fleet advanced. No speeches, no music, just quiet determination. Across space, Imperial outposts suddenly detected the approaching ships. Their alarms rang, messages were sent, and defensive shields rose. But before any real communication could happen, the Federation's defensive operation had already begun. The first round of electronic strikes disabled several of the Empire's communication relays. Power grids flickered. Navigation systems went offline. No one was hurt, but the message was clear. Back in the Federation, the news broke instantly. Anchors used words like precision mission and measured response. The public celebrated. People cheered in the streets, waving Federation flags. To them, it wasn't war, it was justice. It was their leaders showing strength. For the first time in weeks, people felt proud instead of afraid. They believed the Federation had taken control of the situation, but on the other side, in the Empire, the story sounded very different. Their news stations called it an unprovoked attack and a betrayal of peace. The Empire's citizens watched as images of damaged outposts filled their screens. Anger spread just as fast as it had among the humans. In one Imperial city, a crowd gathered outside their palace demanding answers. Their emperor appeared briefly on screen, his expression cold and steady. "If they want conflict," he said, "then they will learn what conflict means." His words were broadcast across all Imperial worlds. Within hours, their fleets were mobilized. Meanwhile, Admiral Ortega received reports that the Empire had begun moving heavy forces toward the border. Her communications officer turned pale. "They're responding fast," he said. Ortega only nodded. She had expected it. "Prepare defensive positions," she replied. "We'll hold the line." For days, both sides sent warnings back and forth. Officially, neither admitted that war had started. But in truth, everyone knew it had. Trade stopped. Diplomats were recalled. The space between the two powers became a silent battlefield, filled with tension, fear, and waiting. In homes across the Federation, families watched the news every night, listening for updates. Some spoke proudly about defending their nation. Others quietly prayed that it would all end soon. Mothers worried about sons who had just been called for service. Children asked questions adults couldn't answer. In a small apartment overlooking the capital's skyline, Lyra sat watching the glowing lights outside her window. She had once worked beside the ambassador, believed in his dream of peace. Now every screen around her showed fleets, flags, and fiery speeches. She felt lost. She didn't know who to believe anymore, her government, the news, or her own heart. Her friend visited that evening, trying to comfort her. "Maybe it's for the best," he said. "We need to stand up for ourselves." She looked at him sadly. "Standing up is one thing," she whispered. "Destroying everything we've built is another." He didn't reply. He didn't know what to say. Outside, fireworks were going off, not to celebrate peace, but to celebrate victory from the first operation. People smiled, unaware that it was only the beginning of something much darker. Over the next few weeks, the Federation continued its defensive missions. Each one was described as controlled and precise, but little by little the line between defense and offense began to blur. Every time an outpost was destroyed, the Empire responded with more aggression. Every retaliation made the Federation push harder. It was a cycle that no one could break. Admiral Ortega spent sleepless nights in her command room, reading reports, watching the growing list of responses. Each one meant more tension, more lives disrupted. Her officers congratulated her for her leadership, but she felt no pride. "We're not winning," she told her second officer quietly. "We're just losing slower." Meanwhile, in the Federation's government halls, speeches became stronger, louder, more emotional. Politicians used words like duty, honor, and justice. They promised that this was not war and it was protection. The people believed them. They wanted to believe them. On imperial worlds, their leaders gave similar speeches. "They started this," one declared. "We will finish it." Their citizens cheered too, just as the humans did. Two sides, two voices, one story told differently. But beneath all the pride and noise, there was fear. Quiet fear, the kind that no one admitted but everyone felt. Lyra began writing in the ambassador's old journal, continuing where he had stopped. She wrote about the people she met, workers, students, families, all trying to live normal lives while the world shifted around them. "Nobody wants war," she wrote one night, "but nobody knows how to stop it." In space, both fleets remained on high alert. Every small move, every flicker of a radar signal could cause panic. Commanders were tired, officers restless. There were no clear orders anymore, only a constant sense of waiting. Then one day, a Federation transport carrying supplies went missing near Imperial territory. The Empire said it had entered restricted space. The Federation said it had been taken. Both sides accused the other of lies. The Federation Council met again. The president looked older now, worn down by sleepless nights and endless meetings. "How did we get here?" he whispered under his breath, not expecting anyone to answer. One of his ministers leaned forward. "Sir," he said softly, "we can still stop this." But before anyone could agree, a new report came in. Imperial forces had launched a counterstrike at the border. No one was killed, but several Federation ships were damaged. The room fell silent. The president closed his eyes and spoke the words no one wanted to hear. "Then it's official," he said. "The war has begun." Across the galaxy, messages spread like fire. People cheered, cried, shouted, prayed. Some called it justice. Others called it madness. Lyra stood by her window once more, watching the night sky glow faintly with distant flashes. She opened the journal and read the ambassador's last words again. "Tomorrow, peace will begin." She smiled sadly and whispered, "Tomorrow, maybe peace will return." But months passed since the first strikes. The war between the Human Federation and the Empire had now become part of everyday life. What started as a single spark had turned into a storm spreading across the stars. Every broadcast, every headline, every conversation was about the war. People no longer talked about peace. They talked about survival, victory, or revenge. Factories worked day and night to produce supplies. Young men and women left their homes to join the defense forces. Streets once filled with laughter now echoed with sirens and announcements. The war had become a normal part of existence, something people lived with like bad weather that refused to end. But even in the middle of this chaos, there were those who began to ask questions, quiet questions that most people ignored. Among them was a young journalist named Ria Kovan. She wasn't famous or powerful, but she was stubborn. She didn't believe everything she was told, and she had a feeling that something about this war didn't add up. She had covered political stories before, but this was different. Every time she asked about the ambassador's death, the event that started it all, she was told to move on. "It's history now," one official said. "Focus on the present." But Ria couldn't let it go. Deep inside, she felt that the truth was being buried. Her curiosity began as a simple thought. What if the ambassador's death wasn't what it seemed? She started digging through old reports, archived messages, and medical files. Most of them were heavily censored, with entire pages blacked out. The official story still claimed it was an assassination carried out by Imperial agents, but there were strange inconsistencies, missing timestamps, unsigned reports, even conflicting medical conclusions. The more she looked, the stranger things became. One file mentioned that the ambassador's personal security team had been replaced 2 days before his death, something that had never been reported publicly. Another document listed a shipment of unknown equipment sent to the embassy around the same time. None of it made sense. Ria tried to contact her old sources in the government, but most refused to speak. A few whispered warnings. "Be careful. Some things are better left alone." That only made her more determined. Meanwhile, on the front lines, Admiral Ortega watched the war take its toll. What had begun as defensive action had turned into endless battles. She rarely slept, spending most of her time reading casualty lists and repair reports. Each day felt heavier than the last. She still believed in duty, but not in the reasons she'd been given for this war. Something about the Federation's justifications no longer felt right. She had begun to notice that even small victories were treated as massive propaganda. The truth was that both sides were losing ships, losing hope, losing themselves. One evening, she received a message from the capital marked confidential. It wasn't a command. It was a file, a report titled Operation Catalyst. She opened it thinking it was another tactical plan, but what she saw made her freeze. The document contained evidence that the ambassador's death might have been staged, not by the Empire, but by a secret group within the Federation's intelligence division. It hinted that the goal had been to provoke the Empire into conflict, ensuring unity and control at home. The words were vague, but the meaning was clear. Ortega stared at the screen for a long time. She didn't want to believe it. "No," she whispered. "That can't be true." She deleted the file from her personal log, but the words stayed in her mind like a shadow. A few days later, she received a coded message from someone calling themselves The Witness. It said, "You're not the only one who's seen the truth." Across the capital, Ria had just received the same message. At first, she thought it was a trap, but when she opened the attachment, her heart pounded. It contained fragments of official transmissions, communications between military officers dated days before the ambassador's death. The messages discussed necessary action, public reaction, and media control. Ria realized she was holding pieces of the same puzzle that the Admiral had seen. She tried to verify the information by meeting one of her old contacts in the Intelligence Bureau. They met in a quiet cafe far from the city center. The man looked nervous, constantly glancing at the door. "This war," he said in a low voice, "wasn't supposed to go this far. It was meant to unite the Federation, to give people a common purpose. But they lost control." "Who are they?" Ria asked. He hesitated. "People high above us. People who believed that peace made us weak. The ambassador was going to expose corruption in the trade deals with the Empire. If he had lived, the public would have seen how deep the lies went." Before she could ask more, the man stood and left quickly, disappearing into the crowd. That night, Ria couldn't sleep. The world she thought she knew felt like it was falling apart. The diplomat had died believing in peace, but now it seemed he had been killed by those who feared it. She began publishing anonymous reports under the name The Voice of the Lost. The articles didn't accuse anyone directly, But they asked questions, dangerous ones. Who truly benefited from this war? Why were so many files about the ambassador's mission erased? Why were the Federation's own agents disappearing? At first, people dismissed her work as conspiracy. But then a few soldiers started to speak anonymously. They confirmed strange orders, missions that made no strategic sense, targets that seemed chosen for political reasons rather than defense. Soon, rumors began to spread throughout the Federation's networks. Was the war built on a lie? In the capital, the president's advisors panicked. They began censoring news channels and blocking information. But it was too late. Once doubt entered people's minds, it grew like a storm. Admiral Ortega, hearing about these reports, secretly contacted the source known as the Voice of the Lost. When she discovered it was Rhea, she agreed to meet her. They met through a secure channel, both cautious, both scared. Rhea showed the Admiral the file she had collected. "I don't want to destroy the Federation," she said. "I just want people to know the truth." Ortega listened silently, her face unreadable. "If this is true," she said finally, "then everything we fought for is a lie. But exposing it will tear our world apart." Rhea nodded. "It's already falling apart. At least let people know why." The Admiral promised to think about it. That night, she looked out at the endless stars and wondered how one truth could be so dangerous. The next morning, Federation Command issued a new order, a large-scale offensive against the Empire. Ortega received the command but didn't act immediately. Her conscience battled her duty. She knew this attack would cost countless lives, and she wasn't sure it was even justified. As she hesitated, a message came from Rhea. "They'll blame the Empire for every move you make. You still have a choice." That same day, Federation intelligence began hunting for the person behind the Voice of the Lost. Rhea had to move constantly, changing her location, using old communication lines to stay hidden. She didn't see herself as a hero. She was just trying to stop a lie from destroying more lives. Her final transmission reached millions of citizens through hacked broadcast channels. It was short and direct. "You've been told this war was started by the Empire, but the documents show otherwise. The truth was buried to keep you obedient. Ask yourself, who profits from endless fear? Who silences questions? Don't hate your neighbors across the stars. They grieve just like you." The message spread faster than the government could erase it. People started demanding answers. Soldiers questioned orders. Some refused to fight until they knew the truth. In the capital, panic spread among officials. Arrests were made. The president tried to calm the population, but even his voice sounded hollow now. He promised transparency, but few believed him anymore. Rhea disappeared soon after her last broadcast. Some said she escaped to a neutral colony. Others said she was taken by the same people she had exposed. No one knew for sure. Admiral Ortega, after hearing of Rhea's disappearance, made her own decision. She secretly recorded a statement confessing what she had learned, and sent it to trusted officers who still believed in honor. "If I fall," she said in her message, "let the truth live on." As the war continued to burn across space, small protests began on Federation worlds. People started questioning everything, the speeches, the news, even the leaders they once worshipped. The same happened within the Empire. Soldiers on both sides began realizing that maybe they were not fighting enemies, but reflections of their own fears. The truth had not ended the war, but it had changed it forever. Somewhere, far from the cities and fleets, an old recording of the ambassador's final words played in a museum. "Peace is not the absence of war, it is the courage to trust." His words echoed softly through empty halls, a reminder of what had been lost, and in that quiet, a single idea began to grow again, that even in the darkest lies, a small light of truth can still survive. The war had been going on for so long that people could hardly remember how it began anymore. What started as anger had now become exhaustion. Entire generations were growing up without knowing what peace even felt like. Cities that once shined with lights were now covered in dust. Empty homes stood as reminders of the families who never came back. The Federation broadcasted messages every day, promising victory and justice. But the faces of the people told another story. They were tired, broken, and uncertain. Admiral Ortega sat inside her command ship, staring at the endless stars outside her window. Reports came in one after another: destroyed ships, missing soldiers, lost colonies. She had once believed this war was necessary. She had once stood proud and told her crew they were fighting for honor. But now even the word victory felt empty. She thought of the message from Ria, the journalist who had risked everything to reveal the truth. Ria's words still echoed in her mind. They'll blame the Empire for every move you make. You still have a choice. The Admiral had seen the truth herself. She had read the files that proved the ambassador's death wasn't what the people were told, but it was too late. The fire that had started from one lie had already consumed everything. She couldn't stop the war, not alone. Back on the capital world, life was changing too. People no longer trusted the Federation Council. Protests grew in every district. Civilians marched holding banners that said, "Bring them home and tell us the truth." The government tried to silence them by cutting communication networks, but the truth had already spread too far. In small towns and colonies, people refused to send their sons and daughters to the military. Families hid their children, afraid they would be taken away to fight in a war they no longer believed in. The soldiers themselves began to question their orders. Some refused to attack, some left their posts quietly, vanishing into unknown places. Inside the Federation's main headquarters, chaos ruled. Leaders blamed each other for the failure. No one wanted to admit that their lies had been exposed. They started creating new stories to distract the public, claiming the Empire had spread false information to divide humanity. But the people were not fools anymore. On one of the outer colonies, a young soldier named Aaron sat beside the wreckage of his ship, watching the smoke rise into the sky. He had lost his entire team during a surprise attack. He was one of the few survivors. He had believed in the Federation once, believed they were defending humanity. But after hearing the leaked recordings, he wasn't sure anymore. He looked up at the stars and whispered, "Why are we fighting?" His voice was soft, but that same question was being asked everywhere. By soldiers, by workers, by families, by leaders who couldn't sleep. Admiral Ortega received new orders from the Council, a massive final strike to end the war once and for all. It was the largest military plan in Federation history. But Ortega hesitated. She knew this strike would destroy entire planets, both human and imperial. Millions of innocent lives would be lost. She couldn't bring herself to give the command. For the first time, she refused to follow orders. She called her officers into a private meeting and said quietly, "If we continue this, there will be nothing left to save." Some of her officers were shocked. Others nodded silently. They too had lost faith, but disobeying the Council meant treason. It meant death. Meanwhile, the Empire was falling apart too. Their emperor had been assassinated by his own generals, who were tired of the endless war. The Empire's planets were starving. Entire cities were abandoned. The leaders were desperate to surrender, but there was no one left who trusted anyone. The galaxy had become a graveyard of promises. In the Federation capital, the president held a meeting with his advisors. The truth about the ambassador's murder was now fully public. Secret files were leaked to every major news outlet. The public outrage was uncontrollable. People demanded justice. Some called for the president to resign. Others wanted a full investigation. The president looked tired and old. He rubbed his face with both hands and said quietly, "We thought we were saving humanity, but we've destroyed it," but not everyone agreed. Some hardliners still believed the Federation had done the right thing. They said, "We can't turn back now. If we stop fighting, everything we built will fall apart." And in some ways they were right. The Federation's economy, its industries, its power, all depended on the war. Stopping it meant admitting guilt. It meant losing everything. The days passed in silence on the front lines. Neither side moved. Both armies waited for orders that never came. The soldiers didn't want to fight anymore. They sat in their bases, watching old messages from home, listening to songs from a time before war. Admiral Ortega decided to take one final step. She recorded a message, not for her government, but for the people. In her calm, steady voice, she said, "We have been told that we are fighting monsters, but the real monsters are the lies that made us forget who we are. This war began with a tragedy, but it continued because of greed and fear. We were told that vengeance would bring justice, but vengeance only brought more pain. If I am punished for saying this, so be it. I will not destroy another world for a lie." She sent the message across all open communication channels. Within hours, it reached millions of people. Soldiers, civilians, even members of the Empire. The message spread faster than the Federation could block it. In the following days, several fleets refused to follow orders. Commanders laid down their weapons. Some ships crossed enemy lines to deliver peace requests directly. At first, the government tried to call it rebellion. But soon it became clear that the people were no longer afraid. In one of the refugee camps, an old man heard Ortega's message and wept quietly. He said, "Finally, someone remembered we are human." Across the border, an imperial officer listened to the same message and told his men, "The war is ending. Go home," but peace did not come easily. There were still leaders who wanted to keep fighting, still extremists who refused to stop. Skirmishes continued, but they were smaller now, weaker. The fire that once burned bright was slowly dying out. The Federation Council collapsed within weeks. Some members were arrested. Others fled. The president resigned and disappeared from public view. A temporary council was formed to negotiate an end to the war. Admiral Ortega stood before that council, not as a hero, but as a witness. She told them everything she knew about the ambassador's murder, the manipulation, the lies. She didn't try to justify her role. She simply said, "I followed orders that cost millions of lives. I can't change the past, but I can tell the truth." The council decided to form a tribunal to investigate the war. The goal was not revenge, but understanding, to make sure humanity never repeated the same mistake. As the months passed, peace talks began between the remaining Federation worlds and the broken Empire. It was slow, fragile, and filled with distrust, but it was a beginning. Ria's writings, the ones she had published anonymously, became known everywhere. People read them in schools and gatherings in quiet corners of broken cities. Her words became a symbol of courage and truth. No one knew where she was, but her voice lived on in every person who refused to believe in hate. For the first time in many years, the stars seemed peaceful again. Ships no longer carried weapons. They carried supplies, medicine, and messages of rebuilding. People began planting gardens where bombs had fallen. Children who had only known fear started learning the meaning of hope. Admiral Ortega visited one of the old battlefields where millions had died. There was nothing left but silence and dust. She knelt down and whispered, "I'm sorry." A group of young students found her there. They didn't recognize her. One of them asked, "Why are you here?" She smiled softly and said, "To remember." Because remembrance was the only way to heal. The cost of vengeance had been too high. Humanity had won nothing but pain. But from that pain grew wisdom, the understanding that no war born from lies can ever be justified. And as the sun rose over the rebuilding cities, the people finally began to dream again, not of power, or conquest, or revenge, but of peace that would last. Years passed after the war ended. The stars that once burned with the fire of battle had grown calm again. The sound of weapons, the roar of engines, and the endless alarms were now memories carried by those who had lived through it all. The great cities that had once been covered in smoke were slowly rebuilding. Brick by brick, people worked together, not soldiers now, but survivors, engineers, teachers, and dreamers. Every person carried scars, some visible, some buried deep inside, but they also carried hope. A hope that maybe this time humanity would not repeat the same mistakes. The Federation no longer existed as it once did. Its grand halls were now silent. The banners that had once promised glory were taken down. In their place, a new council was formed, one not built on power but on responsibility. Representatives from every surviving colony, and even from the old empire, gathered to build something different. A united peace council. Among them was Admiral Ortega. She was no longer an admiral now. She had resigned from her post the day the tribunal began. But people still looked at her with mixed feelings. Respect from some, blame from others. She had been both a leader in war and a voice for truth. She knew she could not escape her past, but she also knew she could help shape what came next. The tribunal hearings were long and painful. Witness after witness came forward to tell their stories. Soldiers who had followed orders they didn't believe in, families who had lost everything, and officers who had discovered too late that they had been fighting for a lie. Ortega spoke honestly when her turn came. She didn't try to defend herself. Her voice was calm but heavy with regret. "We believed we were protecting our people," she said. "But in truth, we were protecting the lies of a few." I take responsibility for my part in this. I cannot change what was done, but I can help rebuild what was lost." There was silence in the chamber when she finished speaking. No applause, no anger, just silence. It was the sound of a world realizing how far it had fallen, and how much it still had to climb to reach peace again. Far away, in a quiet settlement on the edge of a green valley, a woman lived under another name. Her hair had turned gray, and her face showed the years she had spent running from danger. Few knew that she was the journalist who had started the truth movement. She had once been called a traitor, then a ghost, and finally a hero. She spent her days writing again, not about war this time, but about healing. Her latest book was called The Lies That Burned the Stars. It told the story of what really happened, how one death, one secret, had led 2 civilizations into destruction. She wrote it not to blame anyone, but to remind everyone of what unchecked anger could do. Her book spread slowly but powerfully. It was read in schools and peace academies. Students cried as they read the stories of families torn apart and soldiers who never came home. And through those tears, they learned why truth mattered more than pride. Back in the capital, the Peace Council worked to rebuild connections with the old empire. At first, the talks were cold and filled with suspicion. The memories of war were still too fresh, but slowly, the 2 sides began to understand that they had both suffered from the same lies. They had both lost people they loved. In one meeting, an elderly representative from the empire said softly, "We all bled under the same stars. Let those stars guide us now, not into war but into understanding." No one spoke for a while after that. Many had tears in their eyes. It was the first time in decades that a sentence about unity had not sounded like a dream, but like something possible. As part of the rebuilding, memorials were built on worlds across the galaxy. They were not made of marble or gold, but of simple stone. Each had a small flame burning at its center, a reminder of both the lives lost and the light that truth could bring. Admiral Ortega visited one such memorial on a planet that had once been one of the bloodiest battlefields. Children now played near the site, unaware of the horror that had once unfolded there. She sat on a bench and watched them, smiling faintly. A young boy came up to her and asked, "Did you fight in the war?" She nodded slowly. "Yes," she said. "Did you win?" he asked. She looked at him for a long moment and finally replied, "No one wins a war like that, child. We only survive it." The boy frowned, not fully understanding, and ran back to play. But Ortega's words stayed in the air like a whisper carried by the wind. The new generations were growing up in a time of peace, but the old ones still carried the ghosts of the past. Some nights, veterans gathered together in quiet halls to talk, not about battles or victories, but about what they remembered, what they regretted, and what they hoped their children would never have to face. One of them, an old mechanic, once said, "We built ships to fight. Now we build bridges. I think that's a better use for our hands." The Peace Council declared a yearly Remembrance Day, called the Day of Truth. Every year on that day, the people of all worlds would stop for a single hour. No trading, no ships flying, no speeches. Just silence. A silence to remember the cost of lies and the price of vengeance. On the 10th day of truth, Admiral Ortega stood on a stage overlooking a large crowd. The stars above were bright and peaceful. She spoke softly, her words reaching every corner of the galaxy through a live broadcast. "We once believed power was the answer. We thought vengeance would bring justice, but vengeance blinded us. It made us forget the value of life. The war ended when we began to listen, not when we began to fight. Let this day remind us no truth is too dangerous to tell, and no lie is too small to destroy." Her speech was short, but it stayed in people's hearts. That night, lights shone from every planet as people lit candles in their homes, remembering both the fallen and the survivors. In her small house far away, the old journalist watched the ceremony on her screen. She smiled through her tears. The world she had dreamed of, one where people spoke truth without fear, had finally begun to exist. She closed her eyes and whispered, "You did it, humanity. You finally learned." A week later, news spread across the network that she had passed away peacefully in her sleep. The Peace Council held a special gathering in her memory. Her writings were placed in the central archives of the new United Worlds, where future generations would study them as lessons of history and courage. Years later, When young students visited those archives, they would read her words and then see Admiral Ortega's recorded confession beside them. The two women, one a soldier, one a writer, had lived very different lives, but together they had helped humanity find its soul again. Time continued to move forward. New inventions, new cities, and new ideas filled the galaxy. People began exploring once forbidden zones of space, not to conquer them, but to understand them. The phrase "never again" was engraved on monuments across the stars. One evening, a young historian who was collecting stories from the war found an old recording labeled simply, "Ambassador's Final Message." Curious, she played it. The voice of the ambassador filled the room, calm, steady, and full of hope. "If you hear this message, it means my mission is complete one way or another. Remember, peace is not made in treaties or signatures. It lives in the hearts of those who choose to understand instead of hate. If ever my death is used to start another war, then I have truly failed. But if it reminds you to question, to think, and to forgive, then perhaps it will not have been in vain." The historian sat quietly after listening. She realized that those words had shaped everything that followed. A man's death had once destroyed worlds, but his message had later rebuilt them, and so the story came full circle, from destruction to understanding, from hate to truth, from war to peace. The stars outside shone brighter than ever, not with the fire of weapons but with the glow of renewal. Humanity had finally learned that truth once lost could still be found again, and that even the darkest night can end in light.